So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the North Door Theater Lounge.
Hello, folks. I'm Lance Fever Myers.
And welcome to another edition of Persistence of Vision podcast. That's right, make some noise out there.
That's LBDO.
This is our...
And that's for the very first time in POV publishing podcast history, we are recording in front of a live studio audience.
We are delighted to be here. And we have none other than the great Neal Pollack. Never mind the Pollacks. He is here with us. He is prepared mentally, physically. He's an athlete, as you know, a Jeopardy champion and a writer. How many books have you published, Neal?
I have published 10 books.
10 books. That's more than you have, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, that's my assumption. My name is LBDO. This is my co-host, Lance Fever Myers.
Hello, everyone.
And, every time we get together to talk about some book, either with an author or with someone who has read a book, and we wonder, how can anyone read a book, much less write one?
What are these books you're talking about?
Yeah, what are these books? We see them in the store window, and we wonder. Tell us, Neal, what is a book?
Yeah, I've been having trouble reading myself lately. Not reading myself, but reading books on my own.
You're not a book.
No, I mean, I'm sure you've gone over this before. There was a time when you just lay around all day reading, and now
lie around, Neal. Come on.
I would lay
a little closer to the mic.
You're
please.
lying.
Yeah, and I find it difficult now to focus for more than 20 or 30 pages before I find a screen catches my attention.
Yeah, there are screens everywhere nowadays.
Everywhere. So what is a book? That's a good question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of us are reading the books on the screens, right?
Yeah. Do you read books on screens?
I have a Kindle, yeah, and I had a period where I was pretty much, when I was traveling a lot, exclusively reading books on screens because they're just lighter and easier to carry around, and you can bring a bunch with you at a time. But lately I've gone back to reading actual books again.
I do too. I prefer the page. I like the tactile feeling of turning a page.
It's hard to travel with
You
200 or
look
300
skeptical.
books. if you
Well,
don't
I
have a Kindle.
don't know. I mean, liking the tactile feeling or the smell, I guess that's all. That's all fun and good. But really, what it comes down to is a book can't run out of batteries.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Sure. But on the flip side, you can't read a paper book in the dark.
That's also true. Yeah. So I that's another thing. It's like you read in bed, and if you are fortunate enough to share a bed with another person, that person usually makes you turn off the light within 10 minutes.
Yes.
And you don't have the energy to go into another room. There's a lot of problems associated with reading, is what I'm saying.
There are problems.
Yeah.
Reading we hear is very difficult. And interestingly,
you don't learn how to do it until you're 5 years old.
That's right. We are in terra incognita, not only because we're performing and recording this live in front of a studio audience, but also because we have an author on our show, but he's not here to discuss his own book or books, since he's published 10 of them.
I can't help it.
He can't help it.
I was seized by a mania.
Yes, I'm sure you'd go back and undo it if you could. But we would like to at least mention some of your books. You wrote a book called Jubal, which is excellent.
Yeah, that's a novel set in the 1930s in the world of Jewish professional basketball.
Sure, which is a real thing.
It was a real thing, yeah.
It was, yeah. And you wrote a book called Never Mind the Pollacks.
Yeah, that was a sort of a grotesque satire of rock and roll and rock journalism.
Yes. What else? Tell us more.
There was a couple of memoirs. I wrote something called Alternadad, which was about my early years as a hipster parent and living in Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Sort of a light little satire of cool parents.
Very cool.
All the parents we know here in Austin are super cool.
Cool parents.
I wrote a book called Stretch, which is a little nonfiction memoir about my adventures in yoga culture. I about my adventures as a training to be a yoga instructor.
A male yoga instructor.
There are many male yoga instructors, LB.
Yeah, but I still choose to append the word male. Well, in addition to these wonderful books that you've written, sir, you would like to discuss, and we are prepared to discuss, a book called Night of the Gun.
By David Carr, right?
Yeah,
David Carr.
The Night of the Gun by David
The
Carr.
Night of the Gun, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, David Carr was he passed away a few years ago of cancer. He was the New York Times media critic, and he wrote about some other stuff for the New York Times as well. But The Night of the Gun is about his years as a drug addict in Minneapolis, when he was also a fairly prominent newspaper and magazine reporter. And it's a harrowing story of just life on the drug fringe. And he in the course of the book, he has these twin infant daughters who he's taking care of. The woman who he's raising them with is even more strung out than he is, and it's full of harrowing stories. So it's a book about addiction and recovery and relapse. All addiction memoirs are about addiction and recovery and relapse.
The fall and the redemption.
Yeah,
a lot of times, quite often.
The redemption, and then the sort of the non-redemption, and then the re-redemption.
Right.
But he pulled off a neat trick in that book, because when you're an addict, especially when you're addicted to the stuff that he was addicted to, like hard drugs, your memory isn't always solid of the things you did. And so he went back and actually interviewed people.
Right, like a reporter would.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it gives the book a little bit more depth and verisimilitude than these kinds of books usually have. So it's a very strong book, and it's a very honest book. I mean, he writes with brutal honesty about how he would beat up women.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, and he was still. I don't know if he would get away with that now in 2010 or whenever, when the book. No, I mean, not that he would get away with beating up women, but if he'd get away with writing about it and just admitting it, and then everyone saying, "Oh, you're great, now you're a bestseller." I just don't know.
Sure.
I just don't know.
But I do think that's one of the interesting parts of the book, that he, actually, and to the point of the honesty part, and we point out that he. His memory was failing because he was on the drugs. But I think one of the things that he delves into is that none of us are really very good at remembering parts of our lives, because we rewrite them to be more favorable of ourselves. I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book. He's saying most of our memories are recrafted, whether we were drug addicts or not, to make us feel like we're maybe better than we have been.
The heroes of our own stories.
Right.
Although, to be fair, even with the reporting, he's still the hero of the story, right? It's like he's still, at the end
the
of the
protagonist anyway.
He's the protagonist, and at the end of the day, he still wins. I mean, maybe he doesn't. He still got to be wrote a book and became a best-selling writer. So, I just found it the things he admitted to having done were you don't read about people surviving a lot of the stuff that he did, much less admitting it. But and he goes on to say how he wasn't proud of the things he did, but
of course,
who would be?
Right.
Yes.
So tell us the significance of the title.
Well, there was an incident in the book involving a gun, and he went back and tried to piece together what had happened.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is the night of the tornado. We are broadcasting to you from the North Door in the middle of a terrible storm with tornado warnings.
Electricity
and flash
could
flood
go out
warnings.
any minute.
Well, it'll be effectively will be a miracle if this ever sees the light of day.
Yeah, there was
a survive.
Well, because it was very hot here in Austin today, but there was a cold front moving behind. I watched a lot of weather today because we were getting very nervous about this storm, and so we just kind of got squeezed between these two weather fronts, and this is the apocalyptic result.
If you're just tuning in, we're here with author and amateur
meteorologist
Neal Pollack.
First warning weather.
So we were talking about the significance of the title, The Night of the Gun. There was an incident with a gun, and he recounts it in the book, and he's doing this interesting reporting technique of interviewing other people about stories, even though the stories themselves are about him, because he can't remember them.
It's kind of, yeah, basically goes back to ask them if he was as big an asshole as he thinks he was.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is usually yes, and more.
Yes, and more. Yes.
I mean, we're all it seems like, all suckers for a redemption story, fall and then redeem yourself sort of story. And that, a drug addiction story falls very neatly into that package. But so it's always, really, I don't know, captivating to read about addicts and all the things that they go through and everything the dark side of all of that. But I felt like the gun thing was interesting. Right off the bat, he talks about how he was remembering an incident where a friend of his pulled a gun on him. And then later on, interviewing that friend, the friend says that it was David Carr who actually had the gun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you pulled the gun on me, God damn it.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like something you should forget.
Right, right. But
Well,
that's
it's
what was
an odd
intriguing.
detail to get backwards.
Right, and it sort of set the tone, I think, for the book, right? That's like, okay, there are plenty of things about my life I'm not going to remember right, and we're going to get to the bottom of this.
Right. And yeah, and so he sourced his own life, basically.
Yeah, which is brilliant for a reporter to do, to go out and sort of break the story of his own life.
Yeah, he had the courage to do it, and he also had the actual professional experience
Right.
to make it possible.
Right.
He's like a Pulitzer Prize. I don't remember if he actually won a Pulitzer Prize or not, but he's a Pulitzer Prize caliber
Sure.
newspaper reporter.
So why this book? What is it? I mean, you
Well-
could have picked any book. Why was this?
Well,
the one?
I have addiction issues of my own, and I am writing an addiction memoir right now. And so, when I was approached to appear on your show, I was just these are the kinds of books that I'm thinking about, basically. And I would say Night of the Gun is the right at the top of the list of addiction memoirs. So it's just I do have some reporting experience myself, but I'm not that's not really my method. I'm not going to use the same trick.
I see.
And could you tell us some stories about your own addiction that are you're particularly ashamed of?
Yeah, I mean, I can. My particular substance was marijuana. The book I'm working on is called Pothead, and marijuana is not considered to be high up there on the list of dangerous addictive substances. And it's true that people don't die of marijuana overdoses like they do of heroin overdoses. They don't have marijuana-induced heart attacks. It doesn't
Right.
give you cirrhosis, et cetera, et cetera. But it in my case, it led to a couple of decades of kind of just irresponsible behavior and kind of random emotional outbursts. So I would find myself not consistently, but occasionally like blowing up at people in public when I was high, like really high, getting into fights in bars.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you observe about heavy marijuana users is that we have an impression of that as a drug that is
That mellows you
mellow,
out,
yeah.
right?
It's not a drug. It's considered a health food in our society.
Right.
It's considered a wellness cure. It's this
wellness.
awesome thing that you microdose and toward the end there, I was waking up in the morning and I was puffing on my vape pen with a cup of coffee. Take a puff of vape, I'd blow it into the cup of coffee, I'd drink the coffee, I'd suck the vape back in, and that was at 8:30 a.m. and then then you have to keep doing it every half an hour to keep it going, and then there'd be some bong hits mixed in, and then maybe a gummy bear, and you just kind of go on and on,
Yeah.
and so I bottomed out in 2017. My mother passed away very suddenly, and I was present when it happened, almost coincidentally. And but right before she died, I had this buddy. It was in Arizona where she lived. I was at the hospital. I had a buddy bring me like a bag of THC gummy bears, because you have medical marijuana in Arizona. So I was stoned out of my mind, at my mother's deathbed. and then stoned out of my mind at her funeral, and on, you know, and I wasn't able, and then I really started to spiral, you
Yes.
know, and fell into months and months of just like very heavy drug use, compulsive gambling, just doing a lot of things that I wasn't proud of, and it ended. Well, I really bottomed out, and it's kind of odd, at the World Series.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lifelong Los Angeles Dodgers fan. They were in the World Series against the Astros in 2017, and I, in sort of almost in a drug haze, I cashed in some frequent flyer miles and flew to L.A. and stayed. I have a sister who lives there, so I was staying with my sister, and I spent $900 on a fraudulent ticket, basically. And when I got to the stadium, they scanned my ticket and told me it was no good.
Oh man!
And I was already like baked out of my mind when I got to the stadium, and I just lost my shit, and I was like, you know, cursing out the security guards and cursing out the security. I was escorted out in a phalanx, you know, from Dodger Stadium, like right before the World Series, and it occurred to me that if I hadn't been a white guy, I probably would have gone to jail. I mean, not for any length of time. It's not like I touched anybody or anything, but I was, you know, or they would have. I had this vision of myself being held, handcuffed to a chair in the basement of the stadium.
Yes.
While the World Series went on over me. You know, it's
If
not what
only.
ended up happening, mind you, but yeah. So that was, you know, and then so I'd like to say like that was the last time I ever got stoned, but it's not. Like, you know, I sobered up about 3 weeks later. Started going to 12-step meetings, and you know, started and entered recovery after that.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you know, it was like you know, you can say that I didn't do any real damage, but you know, maybe I did. You know, who knows? Like, you know, I know I published 10 books, and I know I've had some professional success, but who knows where my career would have
Jeopardy
gone.
champion.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I even won 3 games of Jeopardy. Not while I was stoned, but while I was a stoner. I was sober when I actually did the taping. But who knows where things could have gone and what I could have accomplished if I hadn't, you know, been so, because everything in my life revolved around drugs. Right.
Yes.
Everybody I hung out with, every activity, everything involved drugs. I would say things like, well, it's time for The Amazing Race. I have to get stoned to watch it.
Yeah.
And anyone who's ever watched The Amazing Race knows you don't have to be stoned to watch The Amazing Race.
Maybe
It's
you
not.
do. Maybe you do.
I'm still watching it,
probably
and I'm watching it sober, and
helps.
it's the same show. I'm
Still a race.
It's still a race, and I'm still kind of enjoying it. So you know.
You know, one of my all-time very favorite writers has touched on this very topic of that. You know, we tend to think of marijuana in a certain way, and how it's the psychological effects, the powerful effects that it can have on your life, are sort of, you know, underappreciated. David Foster Wallace has written many things about, you know, I mean, Infinite Jest touches on this very thing.
Yeah.
You know, people who sort of orchestrate their entire lives around these binges of just, you know, like, you know, who is it is it Infinite Jest, or is it Hal, or which character is it that
Daddy
buys specifically buys these and arranges like several day binges where he just holes up and just smokes pot, and then sort of scoffs at the idea of like, why would anyone need to go to a rehab for marijuana? And yet that's exactly what needs to happen.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I didn't go to rehab.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of I won't say I did it on my own, but you know, I wasn't really in the market for going to rehab. But yeah, it you know, and I feel like this marijuana addiction is going to become more and more of an issue in our culture as it increasingly legalizes.
Sure.
You know, I mean, maybe not here in Texas. I don't, you know, that we're still, you know, maybe 75 to 80 years away from that happening here. But you know, they just legalized it in Illinois.
Right.
It's going to start happening piecemeal in other places. You know, they're starting to criminalize shrooms and peyote.
Right.
I mean, I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. 3 years ago, I would have been celebrating it. I would have been like, road trip to Chicago to get high in Chicago legally.
Mm-hmm.
I got high illegally in Chicago for most of the 90s.
So
because that's where I lived.
So going back to the David Carr Night of the Gun, how does it change your perception as a reader to have had these comparable and yet in some ways quite different experiences?
Well, I mean, I believe I read that book after I'd sobered up. I started reading addiction memoirs. I always kind of avoided them.
Yes.
I mean, I read Mary Carr's books about alcoholism and Permanent Midnight by Jerry Stahl, but for the most part, it wasn't a genre I was super interested in. But after I decided, I figured I was going to have to write something, so I was probably going to write an addiction memoir. So I started looking in it. I mean, I was looking at it with with an eye toward narrative flow and and voice and point of view and all that. And so The Night of the Gun is pretty much the gold standard of the genre, I think.
Why is that?
Well, because Carr is just such a good, clear, honest writer. I mean, that's really the key to any writing, as far as I'm concerned, is honesty, especially nonfiction, first-person writing. And that's what makes the book is so visceral, and it's so and you can just kind of sense his pain and his shame and his guilt, and also his dark humor. The scenes of living in the sober house.
Yes.
The weird characters he encounters there. They're very funny. It's especially funny to see a guy like him who, I wouldn't say he came from a privileged background, but he wasn't exactly a person of the streets.
Right.
And he was a professional journalist during this entire period, and just hearing him describe himself become this, bloated automaton. It's just, it was just funny and honest.
And it's hard to avoid the trap sometimes. I think that one thing you notice with addicts is a lot of the time they are like former bullies, where they are confessing but they're boasting at the same time.
Yeah.
They're telling you about the wild stuff they've been through and the stuff they've endured and how in a way it gives them
there's a little bit of that in the book. I think.
But it's
he gets away with, like I said, the stuff I mentioned before, the way he treated women. I mean, he talks about it, but he still did it.
Yeah.
And he still really at the end gets away with it. He still ends up married.
He winds up with a family and with
a family, living in the suburbs, working for the New York Times. There's a relapse in the book where he basically becomes an alcoholic, like a suburban, John Cheever style alcoholic.
Yes.
And he somehow manages to wiggle out of that.
But he owns that. I mean, I think that's how it becomes palatable, is that he's not only owning up to having done it, but he says kind of basically what you just say is I can't believe that I've gone through it. By all means, I should be, crucified for the things that I've done in my life, and yet here I am, and I've made it through to the other side. And why is that? And how is that? And I think that's part of the investigative process that he's going through.
Yeah, and I also just think he happened to, he wrote this book like I said before, he's in a sort of pre-Me Too environment, right? So if you write a book, if I were to write a memoir now and be like, yeah, I was a drug addict and I beat up women, there's no publisher on earth that would touch that.
Are you sure? I'm not entirely sure. I think that's still something that people need and want to. I mean, and again, there's.
You could write a book with a novel with a character who does that, but no, I think that that would be hard to sell.
So you think if Harvey Weinstein were to,
I mean,
were
who
to
doesn't
publish or try to publish?
If Harvey Weinstein were able to write a book as honest as David Carr's book, I think people would read it. But I don't, and he'd probably be able to sell it too. But he just isn't intellectually capable.
I think that's a very important part of the Me Too movement, and I think. Who is it? Our comedian guy, Dave Chappelle, does a really good job of investigating that in some of his latest work. It's the Me Too movement needs to be able to take this and understand that there needs to be a redemption for some of these people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, he got his redemption and then some. It was interesting too. It's all in the family too. Like his daughter, Erin Lee Carr, just published her own addiction memoir, and her own journey into addiction was in a lot of ways stimulated by the trauma of David Carr's death. So it's this endless cycle. It's both a psychological inheritance and a kind of a chemical biological inheritance. So I don't know. It's a pretty cheery topic. There was another book that I would mention too, and alongside The Night of the Gun. It was published a few years after. It's called How to Murder Your Life. I don't know if you've heard of this one, but by this basically like a New York fashion journalist named Kat Marnell, who is a gal about town during the Gawker era in New York, and it's basically like a book about how she was a bulimic and a pillhead and a party girl, and her stories of addiction are simply insane, you know. The interesting thing about that book, and the book is, I think her voice is really funny. I don't know how much of it is funny on purpose, but it, you know, I'm not the only person who feels this way. And you know, that book was interesting because in the end, and spoiler alert, she decides, well, I'm just going to keep doing drugs. She doesn't. Wow. She's like, recovery's not for me.
Interesting.
I'm just gonna keep popping pills and snarfing Twinkies and vomiting them up into the toilet.
Good Lord.
And working at fashion magazines, and you know, and she got paid a bundle to admit that. Let me tell you.
I remember during the Clinton years, there was an article, I think it was in Time magazine, but it was about the new phenomenon, or I guess it was perceived as new, at least by the author, of using a full confession / taking ownership of something as a way to, in a way, avoid taking ownership of it. And it was referring specifically to the moment when Janet Reno said that she took full responsibility for the Waco massacre, and how, at least as the person writing this article said, she's taking full responsibility, but she's not going to be punished or harmed in any way as a result. And it really comes off as a kind of a way of shielding her boss and sort of putting the matter to bed, like, well, what else do you want from me?
Yeah.
This matter is
Right.
closed.
Yeah.
I've taken full responsibility.
Well, you know, yes, although I don't think that being a drug addict is the same as, hopefully not the same as committing the massacre of a religious sect.
Well,
It depends, I guess.
it
I mean, I
depends.
suppose there are some drug addicts who have done stuff like that. You know,
well, I mean, drug addicts do really terrible things. I mean,
They
don't
can.
burn down compounds necessarily.
But I think the point, though, that you're making is an interesting one. That the idea of you know, just by simply saying I take ownership, as a sort of falsely taking ownership, or that maybe as a way to sort of, you know, stage a diffusing of the issue.
Yeah, or you know, even if it's entirely sincere, and even if the person is doing everything right, there's still other people in the ruins of the life that went up so far who might have a right to say, hey, I don't care that you're taking responsibility.
Right.
You know, that doesn't help me in the slightest. You know.
well, there's two separate things going on here. There's the work,
Yes.
and then there's the actual life, right?
Right.
So it's like, yeah, you can, you know, yes, there's obviously something extremely self-promotional about publishing a book about your problems and expecting everyone to feel empathetic toward you. But in your actual life, you still have to change the way you move through
Right.
the world. You have to, as they say in 12-Step Land, make amends to
Sure.
the people you've harmed. You have to basically like reinvent yourself.
Right.
And that can't be faked, you know. And if the people who still care about you when it's all over, when the dust clears, you know, if they don't see a change, then they're gonna know. You know, you can say whatever you want in the pages of a book. You know, those are two very, very different scenarios.
Sure.
Yes. What are some other addiction memoirs that you recommend?
Well, there's Permanent Midnight by Jerry Stahl, which is, you know, at least 30 years old now, but that's an extremely funny and
That was a movie also, right?
yeah, starring Ben Stiller, which Jerry Stahl wrote, and extremely funny and harrowing account of being basically a cocaine addicted TV writer in the 80s.
And cocaine at one.
Yeah,
What's that?
What the hell?
Yeah, but he was. I mean, you know, he has some really, really. He was more than a coke head. He was a stone junkie. So what else? You know, like I said, like there's Mary Carr's alcoholism memoirs are very good. Those
Any
are the
relation to David Carr, Mary Carr?
No, she's spelled different. She spells it K.
Mary Carr's actually from Groves. She's from
K-A-R.
She really, and she also
she's from Port Island.
was dated David Foster Wallace, so to tie that back to the
Yeah, they had a super healthy relationship.
that was
the two of them.
marvelous.
Yeah, a good match. Those are the ones that really kind of come to mind. Those are the ones that stand out to me in terms of the kind of literary quality and entertainment value. I mean, there are lots and lots of of others.
Yes, and the some of the ones that I have heard of. I don't know if you've read like the Basketball Diaries or
The
That's a great
basketball.
one.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, that's a classic.
and of course The Lost Weekend, things like that.
Well, The Lost Weekend is a novel.
Yeah. Oh, it was a novel.
Yeah, but obviously, The Lost Weekend is interesting because that was the kind of the first novel about alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was written around I believe it was a movie, obviously, starring Ray Milland, but it was written in like the late 30s, kind of just post-prohibition, ending of prohibition, and it really, changed the way people look at drinking.
Yes. Well, the whole there was a whole transformation, right, in the Prohibition era and in the era of the Alcoholics Anonymous, the advent of that.
Yeah, and that started very close on the heels of the end of Prohibition, and The Lost Weekend was just sort of brought this stuff to light. The drug addiction memoirs have been a steady genre since, I would say, the 70s. Let's say
That's Fear and Loathing Las Vegas.
But that's Hunter Thompson never
He never
went into
ever
recovery.
apologized,
He just kind of just kept on.
Made it seem really fun and really cool.
Right, that
must be one of the things about being addicted is that you get all this positive reinforcement. There's so many people out there to tell you that the drug you're taking is great and that the lifestyle you're living is fantastic. And
yeah, I mean, there were years there where I was a fairly well-known writer, right? And I was traveling around the country and getting interviewed, and people were bringing the pot to the interviews, and they'd, pack me some brownies to take with me to the next city, and I was being aided and abetted, and everyone was like, "Oh, this guy loves to get high, he loves to talk about it. Isn't that amazing?"
right.
And it cost me a lot of friendships, and cost me, I don't know exactly what it cost me. Didn't cost me a lot of money because people kept giving it to me.
That's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, and which was nice of them.
Well, the one
I
amazing
usually said thank you.
The thing I always notice though is, you and I are friends on Facebook,
Right.
and you will periodically post something about marijuana addiction and whether how it affected you, or just have some article has come out talking about the dangers of the new super powerful marijuana and stuff. And inevitably, the comments will all be from these people talking about how great it is to smoke pot and how they can't understand. They wish you would come back and smoke pot with them and get high with them, and they really kind of like don't approve of the fact that you stopped.
No, I would not say those are the majority of the comments. The majority of people have been super supportive, but yeah, there's always a few people who are usually guys who are very defensive about their own use, and they do say people say it's like there's nothing. I had one guy, you probably remember this comment, saying there's nothing wrong with driving down the street with the window open smoking a joint. I'm like, I think there is actually something wrong with that. I think it's actually against the law.
It is against the law.
Everywhere, even in Colorado. I'm lucky that I'm alive and that my family is alive. I mean, I drove high for decades. Consistently, not just once. I guess you can't drive high once for decades.
Well,
I never got
you'd
Might
have
seem
to
like
be
it.
really high.
Yeah. I just kept driving and driving, man.
Well, Neal, this is tremendous, and having heard about your personal experiences and about these addiction memoirs, I think we're ready to go into our lightning round. Now, as an experienced trivia master, you should probably be more than ready to handle these lightning questions.
Oh, I am.
But we shall see.
Are you ready? Was your buzzer ready?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. When was the first time you fell in love with a book?
Well, that's a good question. I've been reading books since 1972 when I was 2 years old. So
Whoa. 2 years old.
yeah, that's right. And look where I am now. I wasn't even a marijuana addict.
10 books published.
10.
folks. That's when you need to start. 2 years old.
2 years old. There was the first time I fell in love with, there was a one of those little Sesame Street books called The Monster at the End of this
I
book.
loved that one.
Yeah, and I that was my favorite.
I think
book.
that would be my answer too. Now that you said
Yeah, I mean, you ever
that was a great book.
You're going on. People say,
Okay,
the
could we say
portrait
the
of the
full title?
Portrait of the artist as a young man. I would read it over and over again. But no, it was The Monster at the End of this book because it was always Grover.
Oh.
Yeah,
It was
That's a good one.
always Grover. Take that to the bank, folks.
Yeah.
Great
That's
answer.
money.
Next question: has a book ever changed your mind?
Has a book ever changed my mind? About what? About anything?
That's up to you, Neal.
Yeah.
Come on, Neal. You can't just answer a question with a question.
Yeah. I guess has a book ever changed my mind?
Although you do have to phrase your answers in the form of a question.
Yeah, right. I can't really think of an example. I read this crazy book recently. I've been reading a lot of American history, nonfiction American history books, because I'm always trying to sharpen my trivia knowledge just in case I ever get the call again. Miraculously, maybe I wear a fake mustache or something. They'll let me back on Jeopardy. But there was a book called A Renegade History of the United States, and I found it and I read it, and this guy was actually arguing that people who were enslaved in the United States actually enjoyed it.
Oh, my God.
And I'm like, this is not right. This is not correct. This is not. But it was trying to change my mind. It was trying to say
It's
that.
trying.
And it was trying to say that another thing that he said was that the blackface performers, vaudeville blackface performers, were doing it because they were envious of black people. And I was like, this is like some alt-right bullshit right here. So
No changing
so
of
that
your
did
mind.
it did not change my mind.
Well,
The thing is, it's like those of us who live in sort of like this, it's hard to change the mind of someone who's lived in like a liberal intellectual consensus for so long. The bubble just won't pop.
Well, no is a perfectly acceptable answer.
The bubble won't pop.
And it would have been quite a bit more brief and to the point.
Yeah. I don't know what you want from me.
Has a book ever changed your life then?
I don't know. I read Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut when I was 16, and this picture of the asshole. I was like, you can do that
Right.
in a book?
Right. Sure.
Like, this isn't boring. This
The
is
picture of the asshole.
yeah. That was what did it for me.
I love
Was
it.
that concise
That
enough for you?
changed his life.
Yeah,
Oh, I
that
love
changed
it.
All right. Is that good? Okay, that's a length. That's an acceptable length.
Has a
think
book
that's
ever
beautiful.
has a book ever made you cry then?
Has a book ever made me cry? Yes, of course.
Which book?
I don't know. Charlotte's Web. That makes
Okay.
that makes you cry, right? I don't know.
Monster at the end of this book.
Fucking Joy Luck Club. I don't remember.
Okay. What is a book that you have read more than once?
Ken Jennings Trivia Encyclopedia.
Aha.
The World Almanac and Book of Facts.
Okay.
Those are the books I tend to read. The trivia, the books that where you're accumulating.
Spoken like a true Jeopardy champion.
Yeah, those are the. I don't really read books more than once
Okay.
if I don't have to.
Folks, if you want to publish 10 books,
Don't waste your
don't
time
have
Move
reading.
on. Keep moving.
reading
Keep
books
reading.
Don't
more
waste
than
your
once.
time reading. Yeah.
Well, here's the million dollar question. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Yeah, it's like this piece of doggerel from grade school.
Let's hear it.
It's
Bring it on.
It's pretty bad.
Okay.
What the? I know like random lines of poetry, but you want a full poem.
yeah,
What?
if you got one. hell
One
yeah.
bright day in the middle of the night, two dead boys got up to fight. Back to back, they faced each other, drew their swords, and shot each other. A dead policeman heard the noise and came and shot the two dead boys. If you don't believe this lie is true, ask the blind man. He saw it too.
Very
I
nice.
have not heard that in many
Right.
years.
And it's funny. I remember that. Like we had to memorize a poem in like I was fourth grade or something, and half the class told that same did the same one.
Sure.
And that's why I
Why
remembered
not?
it. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the one I memorized.
That
or
was
not.
Emily Dickinson, was it not?
No, it was. That was actually E. Cummings.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it was one of his earlier works.
Beautiful.
Well, this has been marvelous.
Thank you so much, Neal. For
We
coming.
seem to have survived the worst of the storm.
Yeah.
The tornado did not carry off the building.
There was some water pouring down the eaves, though.
Yes, it was really dramatic, folks. I wish you could have been here because our attention was divided between this charming conversation and the question of whether we were going to drown. But the Neal Pollack won, of course, as he often does, 3-time Jeopardy champion, published author, and he beat the storm.
We made it through the rain.
He's a modern John Henry. And Neal, we love you. Thank you for joining us today. Do you have any final words for our studio audience?
Thank you guys for coming. I don't know why you did, but I appreciate it.
Is there anything you'd like to plug? Anything you want our listeners out there to...
Well, yes. I'm the editor-in-chief of a website called, it's a culture website. We run movie and TV and book criticism. It's called Book and Film Globe. So bookandfilmglobe.com. LB has written a couple of pieces for us.
That's right.
Bravo.
That's right.
And I've written dozens and dozens of pieces for us. And we have lots of great contributors. And
He reviewed Aquaman.
it's not, yes, I did review Aquaman, which was a movie that came out in theaters, and therefore it was eligible for review.
Hell yes.
But anyway, but I've been the editor of that for about 9 months now, and I'm really enjoying it, and I think we're doing good work. So
Fantastic.
y'all should check it out.
Yes, very excellent publication, part of the Globe
Sea
family.
of Reeds
Sea of
media-
Reeds family
media,
of websites. Highly recommended.
Beautiful.
And we'll be back next time with more exciting literary context and discussion for you. But once again, thank you so much to our studio audience, to Lance Fever-Myers, my co-host, and of course, to our very special guest, whom we have to have on many more times, Neal Pollack.
Bye-bye.